Good morning, or good afternoon. Thank you guys for coming today. We are hosting a program with ReadSC, Self-Knowledge Center of the Book, in partnership with the Richland Library. Here to bring with us today Raegan Teller, who is a mystery author from South Carolina. Before we begin, if you have a cell phone, would you please silence it? I know that we do not want to interrupt our speaker once she begins. And we, like I said, we are happy to have Raegan Teller with us today. She is a former business writer and a copy editor, marketing manager, and insurance claims adjuster, among many other fun and fabulous titles. And without further ado, I'm going to hand it straight over to you, Raegan.
Thank you, and thank you all for being here today. As Anderson said, I have more or less a business background, and I'm going to talk about today a little bit about my journey to writing and a little bit about my books, and I'm structuring that a little bit differently than what you might expect, but I think I'll answer most of your questions, but if not, Anderson is going to have some questions for me at the end if we have time. These are my 3 books. I write a mystery series called the Edith Blackwell series. Enid is, like me, a redhead and hard-headed, but she's not me. She's braver than I am. She's a newspaper reporter in a small town in South Carolina, so when you read the books, you'll recognize a lot of the landmarks, which people locally love to recognize the restaurants and things like that. I'm going to talk about each one of these books just very briefly because they are mysteries, and I can't tell you a whole lot without giving the plot away. Murder in Madden, all of these books are fiction, but they were all inspired by actual events that had some impact on me. Murder in Madden was inspired by my husband's cousin, who in real life was murdered. She was killed in 1990 here in Columbia. They found her body, but they never found out who did it. And I didn't know her really well, but I'd met her a number of times, and it bothered me. She was 17 years old. It bothered me that she was a forgotten victim, that, she got in with the wrong crowd, she got on drugs, and I can't say that's why the police didn't do a more thorough investigation, but I suspect that had something to do with it, and it bothered me a lot. So I wanted to write about forgotten victims. So that is kind of the theme of Murder in Madden, because the victim in that book is also a 17-year-old girl. The second book in the series is The Last Sale, and that was inspired by, not based on, but inspired by a young lady who disappeared off the streets of Columbia, just vanished. And all I could think about, because the anniversary of her disappearance was coming up as I was writing the book, and I kept thinking, as a parent, how that must feel just to have a child just vanish and you not know anything. The not knowing, the not having closure would just kill me. So book 2 is about a father's search for his missing daughter. He goes to Edith Blackwell and asks her to help him find his daughter. And then the third book in the series, Secrets Never Told, was inspired by my own experience as a juror on a Richland County murder trial. I was an alternate juror, but I sat through all the way up to the final deliberation. And there were some things about that whole process that bothered me a little bit, and so that shows up in this book. I'm about 2/3 of the way through the first draft of book 4. There will be 4 books in this series. And then I'm not going to retire the series, but I'm going to put it aside for just a little while and write some other things. So I've structured this today as the top 10 things I've learned about writing, but they also apply to life, because when I was putting this presentation together and I started listing these things, I was a consultant, a business consultant for almost 20 years, and I had my own consulting company, and I also did executive coaching. And a lot of these things, in fact, most of these things that are in this presentation are things that I've talked to my clients about. So I thought, this is not just about writing, this is about life too. So even if I don't draw those parallels for you when I'm talking about a topic, think about your own life if you're not a writer. Are you guys writers or aspiring to be? Or are you just readers and enjoy it? Okay. So these are life lessons just as well. So we're going to do this Letterman style and we'll work backwards. So number 10 is we're hardwired for storytelling. What I mean by that is when I started doing the research for Hope Gibson was the real victim's name, my husband's cousin that was murdered. My intention, because I came from a business background, as you heard in Anderson's intro, I just always assumed I'd be a nonfiction writer. I'm kind of the reason my protagonist is a newspaper reporter is because that's what Nellie Bly was my hero when I was little. I mean, that's what I wanted to be when I grew up, right? And somehow I ended up in corporate America. But that happens. So I wanted to write a real story about Hope as a forgotten victim because I wanted people to know her more than just the body that was found down by the fairgrounds. But as I was doing the research, she was killed in 1990 and I was starting to do this in 2013. There just wasn't enough information for a book. A lot of her family had died, her mother had died. The police detective who investigated it had retired and moved on. I had enough for an article, but not for a book. And so I was living in Charlotte at the time, and I was sitting at a little sidewalk cafe with a friend of mine, Marcia, and I said, you know what, I think I'm going to write a fictional version about a forgotten victim. Now that just came out of nowhere. I had not thought about that, I had not planned that. It was just one of those flashes of who knows where it came from. And she said, well, that's wonderful. She didn't realize what a huge shift that was for me. So as I started thinking about it later that day and in subsequent days and weeks, as I was kind of gearing up to do this, I started thinking about, okay, I'm a businesswoman. I knew even then, fiction reading is way down. There's far more people who read nonfiction than read fiction. And there are almost no men, sorry, Ryan, who read fiction. The typical fiction reader is 50-year-old or older female. So I started thinking, okay, because I knew it was going to take me a long time to write a book. And I thought, do I really want to invest in a buggy whip company in the 21st century? Is this a dying market? And if so, do I really want to spend my time doing this? I mean, it certainly wasn't about the money. You don't go into writing to get rich and make money. That just doesn't happen. But I did want it to be worth my time to do this. So I started doing some research on fiction. And I found out some interesting things. We were talking about a formula for books. There is kind of a formula for books, and that is the 3 acts. I think Plato was the one who kind of put the stake in the ground and claimed that discovery or acclamation or whatever. But there are 3 acts basically to any play or any book. And you can read books where there are 5 or 7 acts, and they're just a variation of that. But actually there are 3 acts. There's a beginning, a middle, and an end. Okay? And when you're writing a book, the first part, the beginning, is about 25% of your book. The ending is about 25%. And the middle part is about 50%. So think about in the beginning, you're introducing characters, you're introducing the scene, you acclimate the reader to where it's taking place and all that. Then in the middle of the book, you're building, if it's a mystery, you're building your conflict and your suspense, or even if it's just a regular literary novel, you're building your suspense, because a book has an arc. You build up to a point and then you kind of come down from that. And then in the end, you kind of wrap things up. And that formula, so to speak, is what every good book is written on. And did you know that one reason, especially mysteries, more so, mysteries and erotica, which I don't write, but they really work well with this formula because Harvard Business Review published a series, a study in 2014, and they found that your brain produces neurochemicals that are the same kind of neurochemicals that they are produced in real life. For example, in the first part of the book, Act 1, where you're introduced to the characters and you're getting to know people, your body produces oxytocin, which is a neurochemical that your brain produces when you meet someone. I meet Sarah and I say, I like Sarah, I want to get to know her more, I feel comfortable with her. My brain is producing oxytocin, okay? So that's what happens when you read the first act of a book. In Act 2, where you're building suspense and you're building conflict, your body produces cortisol. If you watch TV, that's the stress hormone that puts belly fat on you, right? So reading mysteries could give you belly fat. Not really. But it is the same hormone, the same neurochemical that your body produces when you are under stress. And then when you get to the Act 3, which is where everything is wrapped up and where, closure, it doesn't necessarily have to be a happy ending, but there's some closure to it generally. Then your body produces the happy hormone, which is dopamine. So your body produces those chemicals. They've proven this through studies as you read. So that's why Ryan and I were talking, it is Ryan, right? Ryan and I were talking earlier about, the formula for books. That is the formula, the 3 acts. And you can defy it, but you're not going to be happy with what happens, I'm afraid. So again, as I looked at this, at what happens to your brain, I realized, the first story, fictional story, was written about 2000 BC. I mean, stories have been around forever. They're cave drawings. And I'm going to talk a little bit later about how I think that some of that is changing, not the stories, but the books of fiction. Stories are going to be here forever because it is hardwired into us. There's just no way around that. So with that, I thought I can make my point about forgotten victims, parents who are worrying about their children, or the jury system without writing nonfiction. So I jumped into fiction and haven't looked back. Number 9, ideas are cheap and execution is priceless. I do a lot of signings and people come up to me all the time, which is fine. Don't take this as me being judgmental, because I used to say it all the time too. I've got this idea for a book. Well, yeah, we all have a lot of ideas. An idea is not a story, and a story is not a book. It's to get through a full-length book that's about 200, 300 pages, you have to have a really strong story that's going to withstand the time. Because I said the middle of the book is 50%. That's why they call it the sagging middle, because that's the hardest part of the book, because it's hard to keep that arc going, but not like continuously. You have to bring the action up and down and take it back up. Timing is everything. We were talking about stand-up comedy. It's kind of like that. Timing is everything, especially when you're writing mystery. But it's true of all novels. So my point in saying this is that you have to be willing and able to follow through on that. You have to be diligent in scoping out that story and examining the scenes and thinking about it from beginning to end. I'm going to talk later about my writing process, about outlining and not outlining. So I'm not talking about outlining here, but even people who we call them pantsers, who write by the seat of their pants, even pantsers have an idea of a story and where it's going. If you don't have any idea other than just it's an idea, you probably are going to not be happy with what you produce. One way to stay consistent, and persistence is, you probably heard this, persistence is probably the number 1 skill that a writer has to have. Yes, you have to know how to put a sentence together. Yes, you have to know how to tell a story. But if you don't have the persistence to sit in your chair day after day and write, I write 5 days a week. If I miss a writing day, then I generally write on the weekend. But if you're not able to form a habit of writing and consistently writing, you're not going to produce a book in particular. You probably won't even be able to produce short stories because they're just as hard to write, actually harder to write to me than a full-length book. But one of the most important skills or traits you have to learn is how to say no. Steve Jobs and Warren Buffett both say that the most successful people are the people who know how to say no, because there's so many distractions, there's so many people pulling on you that you've got to learn to say no if you're going to say yes to writing your book. And you have to be persistent when you think you're not going to be able to be persistent. I was telling Sarah earlier, my books are generally around 75,000 to 80,000 words. It's happened with all 3 books, and it's happening with the 4th book. I get to that 30,000 words, which is a little bit less than halfway, and I just hit a brick wall. And I start to question, why am I doing this? Why am I not sitting by the pool with my other retired friends? What is this all about? It's self-doubt, it's self-recrimination. I really can't write. You go through the whole thing. But I've learned to trust the process now. It was worse the first book, a little bit better the second book. 3rd book, I was like, okay, I've just hit that 30,000 mark. I know how to work through this. And you just work through it. But I remember what I read one time about the Navy SEALs. They have this philosophy that most people quit at about 40% of capacity. And if you quit at 40%, that means you've got 60% that you're leaving on the table. So I remember that and push forward when I hit that wall, that I've only used up probably not even, if the Navy SEAL do 40%, I'm probably at 12.5%, you know. So I just keep pushing forward. The other thing that I remember reading one time about this was that there was a rowing team at one of the universities, and they have this philosophy, and it's like, if it doesn't make the boat go, if it doesn't make the boat go faster, then we don't do it. So they ask themselves that question, you know, and that's both a literal and a philosophical question. Will it make the boat go faster? If you decide not to write today, you go to lunch with a friend, is that going to make your boat go faster? It depends on where you want your boat to go. If you want to be social and have friends, then yeah, that's going to take your boat forward. But if you want to be a writer, that's not going to take your boat forward. So learning to say no and learning that execution is just as important as learning the craft of writing. Find your own way. I mentioned earlier that some people are pantsers and some people are outliners. And you can kind of think of them as a continuum. You've got pantsers on one end who don't outline anything, and then you've got outliners like John Grisham, who writes a 50-page outline before he ever writes a book. So most of us kind of fall somewhere in the middle of that, and I kind of fall in the middle of that too. I'll talk in a little bit about, there's 3 pieces of software that absolutely saved me as a writer that I depend on very much. But in the beginning, you don't know what your process is. And so you do things like listen to authors speak, you read books, you go to workshops. And I have yet to go to hear an author speak when they had audience questions that somebody didn't say, what's your writing process? Because that's how we learn. I mean, I've asked that question, I'm still curious. I still ask authors how they write. And while my process has evolved a little bit, about 2/3 of the way through book 1, I figured out my process. And I decided, I had started out learning to write fiction because I was a business writer. I'd done business writing for 20 years. The switch from business writing to mysteries was way harder than I thought it would be. Because if you think about a business writing, let's say a brochure or a white paper, where you're explaining a product or a service that a company offers, you want to answer every single question they have. You want to think in advance. What could they be possibly thinking about, and how can I answer that? There's no question to it. There's no emotion to it. Nobody knows when I write a brochure for a company how I feel about that product. But mysteries are very different because you don't want to tell everything. You can't tell everything. You have to learn how to misdirect. That's called a red herring in a mystery, where you plan a little something and you think, oh, he's the killer, and it turns out to be the lady next door. So you have to use a totally different part of your brain, and you have to go very deep. When I explain these technologies, I just want to emphasize number 7, which it's not the wand, it's the wizard, okay? So regardless of how I'm going to swoon up here about these 3 pieces of technology that I have, that doesn't make me a better storyteller. It helps me organize my work better. It reduces my stress level because it helps me organize, but it does not tell the story for me. So don't get caught up in the tools, so to speak. But the 3 pieces of software that I use the most, and this goes to my writing process, I have a mind mapping software, and I have another, it's not really a mind mapping software, it's called Scaffold. And I'll explain these in just a minute. And then there is Scrivener, which if you know any writers or you've tried to dabble yourself, you probably have heard of Scrivener. And writers either love it or hate it. If you're a linear writer and you write from beginning to end, you start in Word and you just write straight through, then Scaffold may not do anything for you. And I know a linear writer who absolutely hates Scrivener because it is designed for nonlinear people. But what Scrivener does is, you all know what Word looks like, right? Even if you're not a writer, you know what Word looks like. Okay, well that's a word processing. So Scrivener is set up so that on the right-hand side of your screen, you have a word processing section. But on the left-hand side, you have like a column. So because I learned to write from a screenwriter, I write in scenes, not chapters, and then I combine those scenes later to make chapters. And so I might write a scene and not know where it goes in the book. Okay, so I'll write it and put it over here in the left-hand column. And then, and actually I have a little header that says scenes to be placed. And so I'll just stick it under that heading. And so I'll write something, and generally I do start at the beginning of the book. So I'll go back to the beginning of the book that I was writing, but then I'll get into chapter 2 and I'll think, oh, this would be a good scene later on in the book, but I don't know where it goes. So I'll stop, write that scene, and just move it over there under that column that says scenes to be placed. And that's how I write the whole book. I mean, I do try to be somewhat linear, but my brain is just all over the place. And so I write it as I think about it, because I'll think of a scene and I'll say, that's a good Act 2 scene, or that's a good Act 3 scene. Well, you can do that in Word, but let me tell you, it's a mess. When you start trying to cut out pieces and move them around and finding where they go, with Scrivener, it's just a matter of click and drag. So if you're interested in writing and you think that appeals to you, it's a $40 piece of software. Try it for 30 days. If you like it, you can thank me later. If you hate it, sorry. But it is great for a lot of people. Mind mapping software, y'all know what mind mapping is? Have you seen a mind map? If you don't know what it is, you can go Google it and find out. But it basically is a diagram. It starts out with a center idea and you branch off from that. So if I'm planning a vacation, for example, I might put beach in the center. So then I'll put out restaurants, and I might research restaurants I want to go to and list those. And I'll put clothes, and I'll list the clothes I want to make sure to take. So you can do it any way you want to, but it starts out with a central idea and it branches out from that. And you can move it around. You can do it with pencil and paper, by the way. But the reason I love the software is because you can drop and drag and move stuff around. That's great for me because I will first start off by mind mapping acts 1, 2, and 3. And if I can get 3 or 4 scenes in each act, then I know I've got a book. It's not complete at that point, but I know it's more than just an idea. It's more than just a story. It's going to be a book. So that's where I start out. So then once I do that, then I'll start writing the first chapter or 2. And I'll write the first chapter or 2 and see how it's going. And then at that point, when I'm pretty comfortable with it, I'll go back and then I'll just mind map Act 1. So now I'm breaking it down and fleshing it out more so that now I've got more details in Act 1. I keep that software open in the background, and when I get confused, I go back to mind mapping and I'll mind map a little bit more and come back and write. So it's not outlining because it's not full sentences, it's not linear, it's all over the place in terms of how it's sequenced. And it's up to me as I write to figure out what goes where. But that I use throughout the entire process. Scalpel is a $14 piece of software. Now, mind mapping, I'll tell you, the one that I use is pretty expensive. There are a lot more cheaper versions of Mind Manager than Mind Manager, but Scalpel is one that's great for brainstorming with yourself. There's no central point to it. You just put things out there, and I love it when I'm trying to make connections. If I'm not sure, if I've got something that shows up in chapter 2 and I'm not sure how it's going to show up in the rest of the book, I'll start a Scalpel file and I'll say, why is this important? Where does this show up again? And I'll kind of keep that out there to the side, and then as things come up where I might can make that connection, it allows me to see visually what I've got to connect to. So I love Scalpel, I love Scrivener, and I love mind mapping. But back to number 7, it's not the wand, it's not the technology. Those are just tools that help me. It's still up to you to tell the story. And again, think of how these apply to life. I mean, think about, when you see kids walking across the street with phones to their ear, don't you just want to say, it's not the wand, it's the wizard. You need to be working on your wizard instead of carrying your wand around all the time. Number 6 is, what you don't say is just as important as what you do say. Boy, think about a life lesson there. And what I mean by that is when you are writing fiction, and all of what I'm saying pretty much applies to fiction today. There are very different rules when it comes to writing nonfiction. You're reporting research and facts and totally different concepts, so kind of keep that in mind. But when you're writing fiction, you have to learn what to say and what not to say. One of the things that Al Watts said to me one time is that you have temporal linearity. I had no idea that was even a thing, much less that I had it. And what that means is, left to my own natural tendencies, if I have a character that's going to walk from here to across the street to a restaurant to eat, I go in great detail about how they walk to the corner, they check to make sure no traffic is coming, they go across the street, they check to make sure they got their credit card, way more details than you need. So I learned that about myself, and the first thing I do when I'm doing the first rewrite is to say, what can I take out? What can I not say? The other thing is, when you have a character walk into the room, how much do you need to know or tell your reader about that character? Do you need to say that character 6 feet tall, dark hair, wearing cowboy boots? Maybe, if that's part of the story and it helps enhance the story, yes. But if it's not, then leave that to the reader's imagination. One of my author friends says that you write 80% of the book and leave 20% to the reader, and I think that's pretty good advice, because if you tell a reader everything, they're not going to be intellectually engaged with the book. So learning what not to say is just as important as learning what you do say. And I should have said this earlier, but if you have any questions, please stop me. We will have time at the end, but if you have a question about something we're talking about right now, go ahead and stop me. Number 5 is know when to let go. Now, I'm going to sound like I'm contradicting myself, because earlier I said don't let go, right? Don't quit. Don't hit that 40% mark and then quit what you're doing. I'm not contradicting myself, but what I am saying is, if you are working on a book and it's not working and you've done your best to make it work, there's no shame in putting it aside. Most authors have a number of books they've started and put aside. You may come back to it later. Maybe it's just not the right time to tell it, or maybe you need more research. Because actually, even though we're writing nonfiction, I did an extraordinary amount of research, say, for book 3. I worked with the coroner's office. I worked with a forensic sculptor who when they find skulls, they reconstruct the head and all. I did a lot of things, a lot of research for book 3. So you may find that you just need more research. You may find out that you've lost your passion. At minimum, it's probably going to take you a year to write a book. I mean, I know people that write faster than that, but a year is a pretty good clip for writing a full-length book. And you've got to be passionate about a book if you're going to stick with it that long, because you can lose interest very quickly. And if it's not a story that you're passionate about, then it's going to fizzle pretty quickly. So know when it's time to let go. Maybe that book is not a short story. Maybe it's not a full-length book. Maybe it's a screenplay. Maybe you've never tried screenplay. I've been told my books are pretty cinematographic, so I may try to do screenplays after a while. But you need to just know when it's time to let go of an idea. But don't let go prematurely. Make sure that you've done your due diligence and that you know this is the right thing to do. And then pick up the next project and go on. Don't put a book aside and say, okay, this didn't work, so I'm not going to write for another 6 months because I'm not a writer, because nothing could be further from the truth. And also, just throw this in too, is if you have perfectionist tendencies, you need to let go of those. There are all kinds of schools of thoughts about writing. As I said, I studied with Al Watt, whose philosophy was just get it out there. Get your first draft out in 90 days. It's not publishable after you write a book for 90 days, trust me. And I kept my 90-day book just for giggles because it was so bad. But you do need to get it out there. And most people will tell you not to try to edit as you go along, because your editing and writing are two totally different parts of the brain. Editing comes from your left side, analytical, critical part of your brain, and you write from your creative right side of your brain. And if you try to combine those two, you're not going to use either side of your brain. You're going to be confusing yourself. Be persistent, but also know when to let go. And sometimes it's not letting go of a whole book, sometimes it's letting go of a sentence. You might have heard the little saying that writers use all the time, kill your darlings. That means, you write this beautiful sentence and you fall in love with it. And I write these all the time. I think, man, you know what? This is just Hemingway would love this. And it's okay, but, it doesn't fit the book. So don't throw it away. Make you a Word document. Just cut and stick it over there and save it. And every once in a while, go back and look at it. And you'll find a place for that wonderful sentence somewhere. Sometimes there's a whole chapter that just doesn't work. Sometimes there's just, a sentence or two that doesn't work. but it's all a process of evaluating and letting go. Number 4 is don't stand in front of the train. And what I mean by that is that change is inevitable. Gosh, just look around at the world. Change has happened so much since I wrote my first book, published my first book in 2016. It's amazing how much has changed in the book world, but just the world in general, how much has changed. Remember I said earlier that storytelling is in our DNA? We were talking a little bit before we started today about the future of reading. I know, just as I know I'm standing here, that stories will endure. Podcasts are the hot thing right now. And there's stories. A lot of them, I'd say the majority of podcasts are nonfiction. True crime is a big genre for podcasts. But the ones that are successful are the ones who tell a story. It's storytelling. And the people who are good at that, that's storytelling at its best. And there are also podcasts of fiction books. There is a short story dispenser here in the library, and there's one at the Columbia Museum of Art and one at Drip, the coffee place, I think. They're all over the world, basically. And they're little dispensers, and you hit 1, 3, or 5, and you get a story that you can read in 1 minute, 3 minutes, or 5 minutes. And it's awesome. So I think short stories are going to be, there's already a resurgence of short stories. They're all right now more popular than they've been in a really long time. And you're starting to see more anthologies come out from writers of short stories. Cereal Box, which I have up here, is a company that I found when I was doing some research. And it's a company where you go in and you pay a subscription and you get a fictionalized book, just like a podcast, but you get like chapters 1 through 4 or chapters, 10 through 20. So it's basically like buying Audible in sections in the form of a podcast. Ebooks. Ebooks had a resurgence a couple years ago. They're actually down a little bit last year. Print books are a little on the uptick. Ebooks are a little on the downtick. Audiobooks were up like 30% last year. So audiobooks are really having its day right now. So, as I said, the stories will endure. So my point in saying this is, if you are a writer, don't be discouraged that book sales are down, or don't get hung up on whether ebooks are up and print books are down or vice versa, because stories will endure. Find a way to get your story out there. I know a couple of poets who are performing poets, and they'll stand on the street corner and read their poetry, or recite their poetry. I mean, if you want to get your story out, you'll find a way to get it out there. But just don't get hung up on how you read your story or how you present your story. Brand is everything, whether you're talking about your personal brand or your brand as a writer. Some of you may know that my credit card name is Wanda Craig. My pen name is Raegan Teller, and Raegan Teller is part of my brand. And the reason that I took a pen name is not because I'm trying to hide. Everybody who knows me well knows who my legal name is. But I was working with, some of you might know Kathy Pickens. She's an author, a mystery author out of Charlotte. When I was writing my first book, I was still a consultant at the time, and she was a university professor. And she said, you might want to consider a pen name. And at the time, I just kind of pushed it aside, and we had a conversation again. We talked about it, and what she said made sense. My company, my consulting company, was W.B. Craig and Associates. Well, that was part of the brand. When you bought W.B. Craig and Associates, you knew what you were getting. Okay? Murder Mysteries was not on the list of what you got when you hired W.B. Craig and Associates. So for me to stick Wanda Craig or W.B. Craig on a murder mystery was not too cool. And not only that, but you don't want to be, I didn't want to be thinking about, okay, what will I don't put a lot of gratuitous sex or violence, but people do get killed. And there are some social themes in my books that, you never know what's going to offend anybody. I didn't want to be thinking, okay, is this business client who pays me big bucks going to be offended by this? So that's why I took a pen name, was just to give them the opportunity to distance themselves if they wanted to and if they needed to. But Raegan Teller is part of the brand now. And if you look at these 3 book covers, I have a professional book cover, which is called the Midnight Muse. You'll notice that they all use the same pretty much colors. black, white, and red. Those are my brand colors, because any of the branding experts will tell you want to have 3 brand colors. And generally when we go out and do signings or whatever, I'll have on black or white or red, clothing or whatever. So we try to continue that theme. We use a black tablecloth. That happens to be the library's, but that's what I use also. And so you want to be recognizable, not just visually, but you want people to know what you stand for. My books are consistent. If I wrote one book in the series where there was no gratuitous sex or violence, and then the next one it was like a CSI, book, then people would be confused, because I would be confusing the brand. That's why you see authors write different series, and some of them actually write different series under different pen names. Because once you establish that brand, you can really upset your consumer if you change it too radically. We're getting down to the bottom stretch here. The second one is you be you. Miles Davis says, man, sometimes it takes a long time to sound like yourself. And that's true as a writer also. The best advice I got early on, other than pick pen name, was to write the kind of book that you want to read. And that's really critical, because as I said, you're going to slog through about a year of writing probably, and you've got to make sure that this is something that you would pick up and read. Because if you're not going to read it, I'm not sure that you can expect your reader to read it, because your passion is going to come through your writing. If you're excited I wrote a chapter the other day, and I actually had the hairs were standing up on my arm. I put that down and I thought, oh my God, I'm not saying my writing was perfect, but it was just the perfect scene that I would want to read in a book. That's what you want to shoot for. As I told you, I found my process about middle ways or halfway through book 1. I found my writing voice about halfway through book 2. And it's kind of hard to define what writing voice is, but it's kind of like you've heard people define pornography. You know it when you see it. Well, it's kind of the way it is with the writer's voice. You'll know it when you get it, and it just means that you're being authentic. You're not writing somebody else's style, which in the beginning is okay when you're trying out your own style. But when you become your own voice, you know it, and that's when what you write becomes very powerful, because it's coming from way down deep inside of you, and it's authentic. It's you. As Miles Davis says, it's sometimes the hardest thing to do is just you be you. And the final one is probably the most important one. It takes a village to write a book. Stereotypically you think of a writer being an introvert sitting in a room, writing away and not doing anything. And I will tell you, that is the most attractive part of writing for me, is just losing myself and shutting out the world. But it's kind of ironic, because as a writer, you have to have skills that are on the opposite ends of the spectrum. You have to be a good writer and be able to lock out, say no to everything, and lock yourself away from the world and write. But on the other end, you have to get out and do presentations and signings and do all these extroverted things that you may or may not be comfortable with, but that's just, you have to put on different hats and be comfortable with that. So it takes a lot of people to help you, to support you. I've already mentioned a couple people, writing coaches that I've worked with, professional book designers, editors. My friend and neighbor, Irene, over here in the audience, she wears so many hats, I probably won't hit them all. She's a professional proofreader. She has a company called The Novel Mechanic. She is the best proofreader I have worked with, and I've worked with many. She's also my pet sitter. She's my breakfast buddy. She's just amazing. I can't imagine doing this without her. And she's heard this presentation, so she actually shows up to listen to me. It's just really great. My husband, I cannot say enough. Without him, none of this would be fun, because he helps me with, managing the book inventory and finding places where we can do signings and presentations and things. And he keeps the house up when I don't have time. Sometimes I just say, I'm going to lock myself up today and write all day. And he's like, okay, fine. And I shut the door, and he takes care of everything else. Sarah is on my team. All of you are on my team. There's just so many people that support you, and that's really important, because if you think you can do this alone, you can't. You absolutely cannot. So again, this is my series. I'll be happy to answer any questions, or if Anderson would like to ask any questions, I'll be happy to do that too.
Would you rather take audience questions, or do you want to?
Wait, well, why don't we do a couple of audience questions, and then we'll see. Did anybody have any questions? Yes, ma'am.
I just got here, so but it's like, I can't believe it. Because I've been coming here 2 days this week, and I just edited some writing. I've got 74 pages.
All right, good for you.
Go backward and go back forward, do the pages over.
Yeah.
And it's a 10-year thing,
Yeah.
and I left it for years and years. So my question is, like, if you leave some of your pieces for years,
Yes.
and you can go back, because it's almost like an outline that you can use it for, right?
Yes. I mean, there are a lot of writers who write either partial or whole books or stories and put them aside and come back to them later. You know, the one thing about being a writer is that you're writing, everything that happens to you in life comes out in your writing. There's probably a lot that's happened to you in 10 years. I mean, you're human, right? So all those things are going to affect your writing. And so you want to pull on your experiences. I mean, that's the thing, especially, well, if you're writing memoirs too, or mysteries, or anything where there's emotions involved in it. You know, I mean, there's some thrillers where it's mostly action and very little character development, but I really love characters. And so if you're writing something where you have to dig down deep, those 10 years you mine those. You mine those for what you've learned and the person that you've become in the last 10 years. And you go back and you'll see the story looks different. The essence of the story is going to be there. For example, if you're writing a story, as I was, about a forgotten victim, if I put that book aside for 20 years and to finish it later, it's still going to be about a forgotten victim, but it'll be a different story because I'm different. So keep going.
And I like the idea that you mentioned about support, and so that's real good, because I called a girlfriend in Myrtle Beach who knew I wanted to do this.
Yes.
And immediately, she's a spiritual person, and she prayed for me.
Yes.
And then she just, what they call it, where she said that I'm going to receive so much money, and I'm not going to be able to spend it all.
I'm a big believer in visualization. I would tell you just a little short thing about visualization. When I first started writing, after I got the first book out, I was having trouble buying into being a writer. I didn't have any trouble calling myself a writer or an author, but I was trying to visualize my life as a writer, and I couldn't do it, and I thought, something is wrong here. When I finally figured out, I did this through meditation or prayer, whatever, however you want to call it, I found out that what I was visualizing was the stereotypical vision of a writer. Like, we had Charles Tide, who is a best-selling author, come stay with us. And after I saw his life, I said, that is not the life I want. Because, I mean, he was all over the place. Flying. I did corporate work for 30 years, so I was always on a plane or living out of a suitcase or in a hotel. I did not want that life. And so once I realized I really don't want to be a best-selling author, even if I develop the skill to do that, that's not what I want for me. What I want is to be a great Southern writer. You know, if I can get there in my car, even if I have to spend the night, I'm happy. So visualization is important, because once I made that mental shift, it made all the difference in the world. So visualize yourself being and doing what you want to do, and just keep focusing on that. Good luck to you.